Okay, well, I guess the place to start would be Eastern Europe in the 90s. It's where I started my journalism career. In 1997, I started reporting out of the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, and sort of gravitated towards the Balkans where there was a lot going on. And I didn't really come back to the Western Hemisphere until about 2003. And when I did, I was invited in started with a press junket actually. I was invited to the Peruvian Amazon by a nonprofit organization dealing with rainforest conservation. And as soon as I landed there, I realized it was just an incredible uh, story, the future of the Amazon. You had these cultures who had been preserving the the region for millennia suddenly confronted with this sort of just nightmare combination of um, threats from illegal loggers to mining to the narco traffic routes that were starting to, multiply in the region. And it was clear to me that this was one of the stories of the 21st century. And I was sort of there at the beginning of it. So I started to concentrate in the region. I was based in the US, but I was spending about half my time in Peru and Ecuador and Colombia, spending time in these communities, getting to know their cultures, their perspectives, basically trying to understand the complex forces in the region, which I considered extremely important for the future of the planet. It doesn't take a whole lot of back of the envelope math to realize that, the rainforests are key
Mhm.
to the climate puzzle and the functioning of the planet, basically. So I started to spend more time in the region and in particular in northeastern Ecuador, which is sort of ground zero for the despoiling of the Amazon. That was the first real region where US oil companies made contact and started to develop. Um, and those communities were some of the most um, sort of practiced in resistance, including the Kofan. With regard to the Amazonian communities that I've covered, I think the takeaway is these people have figured out a lot that we can learn from, and we'd better listen to them.
Mm.
They're there, they've been there for a long time. They have insights and knowledge and wisdom that are essential to us figuring out our way of the civilizational crisis that we're confronting right now. If we don't take seriously their role in one, preserving these key uh, ecosystems, um, and two, think more seriously about the sort of big picture message. It's really hard to imagine us sort of navigating our way out of this poly crisis that we face right now. That the message is one of um, profound importance, and you know it's that um, encounter is I think a very important one, and it's one that's sort of deepening and taking place in different ways, both through conservation summits and through things even at the cultural level, like the the phenomenon of people in the north doing ayahuasca, to just sort of opening their their minds to different kinds of relationships with the natural world. It's all sort of part of the same uh, communication that is really essential to us getting out of this situation that we're in right now, which is increasingly urgent for
Mhm.
obvious reasons. Oh, of course. I mean, it's been a nonstop process of learning. I mean, I come from the US and I come from a conservation, background where I sort of had absorbed this very 20th century, 19th century idea of nature as pristine and something that had to be safeguarded from all human contact, when of course it's not quite that simple. And one of the things I learned from spending time and living in indigenous communities in the Amazon is that these have always been inhabited um, uh, areas, and the idea that they're separate from all human activity is just absurd. And the sort of balance that has kept them in place has been one of human uh, culture and nature, and it's not this sort of uh, binary of one or the other, but in fact it's about enlightened human activity, not no human activity. And that was a big sort of switch that was flipped. I sort of grew up thinking about just blank spaces, versus the sort of monster, aggressive civilization. And of course, it's not an either or. It's how you engage, nature, and these very old cultures have found a way to do that, that is not ruinous. And that's it seems like a basic insight, but it's one that is takes time if you're coming from a background where it's not so obvious. It's a complex question because you increasingly are finding that these communities are dealing with very familiar modern pressures. So the old ways are being marginalized, and the lessons that they offer are not necessarily even possible anymore. So it's a bit of a sad and tragic picture insofar as the preservation of the old ways are almost as important as their deployment, which is increasingly difficult. Very few of the communities that I've spent time in are anything like they were, say, even 3 generations ago. They're disappearing very fast. I mean, that's one of the things you learned there in the Amazon very quickly, is that the cultures that are easy to romanticize and uh, you know hold up as the alternative are almost gone. You like the effort to save the rainforest is matched by the urgency of saving the cultures that know how to preserve the rainforest. And those two things are sort of equal, I think, in terms of what deserve attention and what we should be focusing on. Green colonialism could be described as still the dominant model, although one that's being challenged and is changing, of conservation groups, major international conservation groups and international development organizations and governments, the approach that they use to protect uh, large swaths of nature and imperiled ecosystems in a way that ends up uh, basically contravening the rights of indigenous groups who both live there and have been protecting those ecosystems for a long time. So you have this paradoxical situation where the um, ostensibly benign intent of protecting uh, areas ends up both denying the rights of their natural inherent protectors and inhabitants, and also undermining their future because those people are sidelined. And what ends up happening in many cases is um, criminal elements who have no interest in protecting anything are allowed to move in, where the indigenous communities who normally would be developing resources sustainably and protecting the territory are basically told to stay out and fined or penalized, and then the government is not necessarily interested in um, investing the resources to keep criminal elements out, or are actively enabling extraction in those same ecosystems. So it's either a paradox or a ruse for development. Um, but a lot of the protected, quote unquote, protected areas in the world are in fact being protected for development, and are denying the rights of people who've traditionally lived there, who actually have an interest in protecting those areas and have the best, the deepest knowledge set to do so. And that is the case with many of the groups that I've spent time with in the Amazon, who are trying to reassert their traditional authority over their ancestral lands. Sometimes it's just ignorance, and it's this sort of, you know, accepting of this model that we talked about earlier of nature versus man, this idea that no culture can have any role in protecting nature. And sometimes it's malice, sometimes it's trying to protect a region for a state aligned development. In the case of the Serengeti, you have uh, hunting grounds that are very profitable for the government and very desirable for Saudi royals. They come and they hunt exotic animals, and they're basically telling the indigenous tribes to stay out. That this is, protected grounds, when in fact it's just, a moneymaker for the government, and it's playground for, uh, you know, Dubai rich kids. So it depends where you're talking about. But it's uh, a lot of shenanigans and a lot of uh, interests that really have nothing to do with protecting nature. Well, the first thing you got to do is make sure that indigenous groups who are the original inhabitants of these protected areas are at the table, um, at the meetings where these things are decided, at the state level, at the international level, you know, at the UN. Indigenous groups have to be present, and they have to be allowed to make their case. Um, and ultimately displacing uh, native communities is going to result in uh, edge area poverty, which you do not want. You do not want the people who are in these areas or adjacent to these areas desperate, because then they are going to be accelerants to the problem. I mean, people have to eat, people have to make a living. And if you deprive them of traditional livelihoods, you're basically going to be multiplying the pressures on these lands, forcing them into nearby towns and cities where they link up with criminal elements, where they link up with the companies who are despoiling these areas. Uh, that's exactly the opposite of what you want. So allowing people to maintain traditional livelihoods that are sustainable and attuned to different values is the priority. Um, and just, the different mechanisms for doing that, I don't claim to be an expert on them, but you have to keep them in the conversation, and you have to make sure that these people are able to flourish in ways that are not going to contribute to the problem. And there are resources, in the rainforests of the world to allow their traditional inhabitants to survive according to the values that they've been able to maintain for many, many, many centuries. And if you end those traditions, if you end their ability to survive, then you're going to just create much more pressure on these places, then they're going to lead to their ruin much faster. And you've seen that again and again. It's one of the saddest things about um, areas where traditional ways of life have been uh, impeded or destroyed. You see this sort of this poverty that leads to uh, a very fast multiplication of the threats that we're all supposedly interested in mitigating. Well, the urgency and the extremity of the climate crisis has led to much more, uh, a much wider reception to the indigenous perspective and arguments like this one in the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years. Absolutely. When I first started writing about these issues in the Amazon in the aughts, it was pretty much crickets. And very few of these articles received any kind of attention or buzz. Fast forward to the late teens, 2020s, much more recently, it's changed, and there's a lot more people who are open to these ideas and are much more interested in them. So that has changed. I mean, as people understand um, the crisis and learn more about the sort of nuts and bolts of what's going on, um, there, and also as indigenous groups have muscled their way into the conversation, let's not deny them their agency here. I mean, they've been working for decades to get to where they are, and making a lot of noise. And so have their advocates and allies, of which I am just a Johnny come lately. Um, but for decades, this has been going on. Let's say 100 years, centuries, to be honest. But that combined with a growing awareness of the clock running down and the importance of maintaining the lungs of the earth, and also understanding that the people who are already there, and that's sort of the low hanging fruit, is empowering them, the frontline communities to protect the rainforests as they're sort of teetering on the brink. I mean, there are some studies that show that it's already too late, that the rainforests are already destined to become dry savanna. Let's hope that's not the case, and that rewilding and re-empowering these communities and stopping the destruction can still stop that from happening. The great dry out. But as people understand that it's a possibility, that we're at that moment, there's been a lot more receptivity. Uh, whether it's enough, I don't know. But I have certainly noticed a difference. A huge event was the fires in that blanketed Rio in Sao Paulo in 20, was it 19, when basically it looked like Dante's Inferno in the two biggest cities in Brazil. I had a story out of Brazil that published about a year before those events, and which I said this is probably going to happen because the cuts had been so severe the previous wet season. When the dry season comes, it's going to be bad. And nobody read that article. It was just crickets. And then when the BBC ran the pictures that morning, that piece had a second life, and it was, one of the most read pieces on the internet. So yeah, just reality has a way of opening space for these stories. And I've seen that again and again. And unfortunately, it's probably going to continue to be the case where people don't really want to think about, you know, pre-literate societies in remote regions until they're forced to connect the dots between them being able to breathe and the role that these cultures can play and must play. You do it with humility, and you understand that you're trying to serve as a kind of bridge, um, And it's an honor, quite frankly, to be able to amplify these voices that are otherwise pretty much completely ignored and uh, sidelined because not only is it a hard thing to sort of translate, but also it's just it's difficult to even report in a lot of these places. And so when you do have a chance to sort of bring these voices to a wider public, it's an honor. And it's not easy. I usually just try to get good translators are important. People who speak not just Spanish fluently, but also local indigenous languages, and try to let them speak in a way that's authentic and um, not being shoehorned into sort of Western expectations of what they're supposed to be saying and how they're supposed to speak. Um, so I've definitely learned to become a lot more sensitive to using indigenous translators as opposed to mestizo or Spanish speaking translators. Um, I've just been a freelancer who's been doing his best with very limited resources to report on a region that is, quite frankly, extremely difficult and expensive to report in. I raise money where I can, but like even the littlest story in the Amazon, you have to hire a boat, you have to hire guides, you have to buy huge drums of fuel. It's extremely hard. And I haven't done as much of it as I would have liked because it takes so much planning and it's so difficult. Uh, I mean, just to spend a couple weeks in a community where you're sleeping in a hammock and getting just chomped by, blood fleas and mosquitoes. I realized the first time I spent time in a community that was threatened and really came to understand where they were coming from, that this was one of the great stories of our time. Because when these communities are gone and when their worldviews are gone, and their traditions are gone, we're in trouble because they really are uh, ideas and alternative worldviews that we need very much um, as models for possibility and sort of re-enchantment of the world. Because if we don't have them, even in very small amounts, as something we can use as touchstones and consulting to consult with them, we're in trouble, and we're already in trouble. But they're precious not just for like the practical on the ground sort of knowledge and role, but also just uh, as other ways of looking at the world. They're disappearing very fast, and they really are, I think, our sort of life raft at this point. It's an underreported region, the rainforest, not just in the Amazon, but in Indonesia and the Congo. And um, there's a lot of stories that need to get covered more. Everything from sustainable forestry, which is often a sham game with international companies just changing the numbers on trees and getting around sustainable labeling. Interpol is on the case, but national governments have to be involved, and pressure has to be brought to bear to make even just basic um, international campaigns like that function. And there's often just not enough attention, and there's not enough resources to make something as simple as protecting rosewood trees from ending up in guitars. So across the board, I would say, and that's just one example of stories out of the rainforest that deserve a lot more ink, so to speak. And we shouldn't just be paying attention when the major cities of Brazil are sort of blacked out. These are day-to-day stories as important as sort of the political situations in our countries, and we should make space for uh, uh, all of them, from the conflicts in Cayamba Coco National Park with the Gofan to the Indian northeastern forest communities who are fighting for their traditional ways of life against extraction. I mean, it's really the same story everywhere. I wouldn't point to any famous journalists or explorers or even necessarily famous activists, although they certainly exist, and there are people worth identifying in the grand scheme of things is important. I mean, really, it's the people that aren't um, bold-faced names and people who don't have books written about them that are the most inspiring. Is just the number of people doing thankless, extremely difficult work on the ground in these places. And so, I'm lucky to count a lot of them as my friends. And they inspire me. People that I'm able to quote and try to amplify their work. And there's just, without exaggeration, there are thousands of these people in the countries where I've worked in the Amazon, Colombia, Peru, Brazil, and Ecuador, primarily. Um, people who are uh, allies of indigenous communities, who help them organize, who help them get resources. Um, a lot of organizations people will never hear about because they work locally, nationally. They're not at the big conferences. They're not winning golden prizes, although some of them are. Um, and those are the people that really uh, sort of make me feel uh, uh, humbled and also energized because uh, there's a certain amount of ego and writing and having a byline, and there's a lot of people putting a lot more on the line, doing a lot more every day for no byline. Um, so yeah, I guess that would be my answer. It's just the sort of everyday activist that never really gets much attention. But there are a lot of these people um, doing the hard work, and without them, there's really no way for journalists like me to sort of parachute in and connect with groups and understand these issues. It would be impossible. And even with these groups, it's not always easy. So they really are the link between the world understanding what's going on in these places. Seek out news outlets that prioritize these kinds of stories. Like Manga Bay is a great rainforest news outlet, and to the extent that they have the ability to connect with these issues and causes and communities, they should. But I mean, the problems that we face are at this point obviously very systemic in nature, and it's hard to say which activities are going to really make an impact. We have an entire global civilization sort of careening in the wrong direction. So every person that can sort of stop and think about why that is and what the sort of root causes of this imminent you know, collapse, for lack of a better word, because we're about to hit a wall and everything's about to come apart. If we're honest with ourselves and we follow the science, that's what it's telling us. People can't really stop and think hard enough about why this is soon enough. So I guess I would just say that you could do worse than listening to the cultures that have been warning us that we were headed this way for the longest. And many of those cultures are in these places that are most imperiled and most important to the functioning of the planet in terms of water and air and carbon sequester and everything. The North-South encounter with the traditions and cosmologies of indigenous communities is an important one, even if there are these tensions. So over, debates over commodification and appropriation, etc. That's sort of the price we pay for wisdom being available. Let's just say available.
Sure.
But we're going to have to work our way through these contradictions and tensions because ultimately it's worth it and it's extremely important. And as some of the more impassioned and romantic advocates of indigenous cultures say, it's possibly our last best shot. And I think there's something to that.